Good evening, everyone. Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm Sarah Guernsey, Deputy Director here at the Art Institute. And it's my distinct honor to welcome all of you to this event. We're celebrating the return of the iconic Public Notice 3, exactly 14 years after it was first installed on the Woman's Board Grand Staircase. Tonight, we have the privilege of welcoming and hearing from the incredible artist, Jitish Kallat. In his talk, Jitish will place this work within the context of his larger practice, a body of work that has been exhibited worldwide. Following his presentation, Dr. Madhuvanti Ghose, Alsdorf Associate Curator of Indian, Southeast Asian, and Himalayan Art, will join Jitish in conversation. Public Notice 3 connects two significant historical events separated by 108 years. The First World Parliament of Religions, which began on September 11, 1893, as part of the World's Columbian Exposition. And secondly, the September 11, 2001 attacks on the World Trade Center and Pentagon. At the 1893 event, Swami Vivekananda, a young Hindu monk, electrified audiences with a powerful speech calling for an end to religious fundamentalism, intolerance, and bigotry. We gather here today on the actual site of the programming hall of the Columbian Exposition. While it wasn't configured exactly like this, it was actually an open courtyard. This is where Vivekananda delivered the speech that is credited with introducing Hinduism to North America. Today, the Art Institute regularly welcomes visitors to view this space, Fullerton Hall, recently upwards of 30 groups daily, nearly all of whom are making a pilgrimage to honor Swami Vivekananda's memory. Appropriately, it is the words of this speech that Jitish placed on the Grand Staircase at the very heart of our museum. Today, more than a century after Vivekananda delivered his message of tolerance and peace, his words remain as relevant as ever. Tonight's event is supported by the Bernice and Seymour Nordenberg Fund. Bernice was a beloved member of the museum community for more than 40 years. With her husband Seymour, she shared a love of the Art Institute and an abiding curiosity about art and culture. The fund bearing their names celebrates their commitment to the museum and the intellectual life of this great city. I share my emphatic thanks to the trustee families present who remain vitally critical to this work. Arjun and Anu Agarwal, Prabha and Anita Sinha. We're also especially grateful to our trustee Usha Middle and her husband Lakshmi for their unwavering leadership and for inspiring the return of Public Notice 3. Jitish, I welcome you. The podium is yours.
Thank you, Sarah, for that very kind introduction and generous welcome back to the Art Institute, a place I feel very, very connected to, several friends and supporters of the work, and wonderful relationships in the room, in the auditorium. So I feel very happy and privileged to see all of you. I also want to thank Madhuvanti Ghose, long-standing collaborator and friend, and Larry Smallwood and Production Plus, with whom we realized both the 2010 iteration of Public Notice and in 2024. For me, it's been a very profound experience to see Public Notice 3 return to the Grand Staircase. Um, it's what I often think of as like a pluripotent place, a place that is at one level a kind of thoroughfare in space. We move through it, but it's also a conduit in time. And Public Notice kind of reimagines this as a kind of portal to that moment of the first Parliament of Religions, to the moment of Swami Vivekananda's visit and his profound words in that location. And I can't think of many or perhaps any institution of this scale anywhere in the world that at its very entrance has its sort of foundational legacy and its sort of origin story interlinked with a very deep planetary historical moment, sort of intertwining into each other and creating what one would think of as a kind of active site to even passage through. And Public Notice 3 sort of, in a way, revisits those words and re-echoes Swami Vivekananda's words in a way to kind of think of it as almost like a prologue to the moving through the institution itself. I mean, since Public Notice 3 was last year, in fact, the world is seemingly in an even more complex place. I mean, there are some 60 wars and insurgencies in the last 2 years. And it feels like these words seem more timely and timeless as years progress. And also in a world where social media and algorithms, in fact, produce more layers of difference, these words seem to resonate even more in terms of making us reflect on the world today. And in between this sort of swelling of human sentiment, 50 nations are going to the polls this year. And half the world's population is in some ways involved in an electoral process that produces its own sort of dimension of difference. At another level, there's this deeper alienation with the planet itself. I mean, I was reading this paper, a couple of years ago by Ron Milo, the system biologist, and his colleagues at the Weizmann Institute, that estimates that for all the mass on the planet, the anthropogenic mass, which is the mass of all human-produced objects, today outweigh all the biomass on the planet, all life forms on the planet. And which is a bewildering thought. That paper says that for every one of us in the room, every week, there's more inanimate objects being produced, more than the body weight of each of us on the planet. And that's this exponential movement we are making from an alive planet to perhaps a dead one. And so in a way, we see ourselves, I think, in a kind of space-time, mind-body, mass-energy conundrum. And in fact, the studio process becomes one of working through those entanglements, to think through those, through those loops that we find ourselves in this present moment. What I'll try and do through the work is, in fact, take you through some recent work, so that we can arrive back at Public Notice 3, and then I would love to have a conversation with Madhu and all of you. The works can be quite varied, and it's not a chronological artist talk, so please bear with me that I'll be making some quick jumps between years of work. But one thing that remains consistent in some of the work is really a gesture we do almost every day. When we try to understand something, we might take an object and take it close or far in space, to even just look at it. We think back and forth in time, often involuntarily, to just locate our thought in the world. And in some ways, what the work does is it sort of exaggerates that focal length in space and time. Some of the work locates itself in a moment long gone by, as does Public Notice 3. And in other instances, it might be a location distant in space. But we'll come to that as we kind of go through some of the work. I also want to acknowledge Swamiji's presence in the room, which I'm very heartened to see you here, as I progress. So this is a piece which I made last year at the Somerset House in London, called Whorled, Here After Here After Here. So Whorled, in a way, is a kind of a thoroughfare of a different kind produced in a civic space. This is the courtyard of the Somerset House. When people come into the space, they enter the spiral from the magnetic north of planet Earth, and as they move through the 400 meters of walking, they would exit from the magnetic south of planet Earth. And this is almost like a drawing in the space, like a 400-meter drawing. Two intersecting spirals. But once you're within the spiral, you start seeing outwards this image of an extended highway signage. And this highway signage was, in a way, produced following all the rules and regulations of the UK Highway Code, which has very specific symbols, fonts. And they begin to measure outwards from Somerset House to the London Zoo, which is just 3 miles. But then progresses to Mumbai or Panjim, Melbourne, Miami, but then to the Mars, distant stars in the Milky Way galaxy. And sometimes it would come upon a star that once was, but now is no more, such as Cassiopeia A, which is now the remnant or the ejecta of a dead star. Or it might come upon a place like Dwarka or Port Royal, which is now completely submerged underwater. It might come upon a place like Mumbai, which is very, very flood prone, and in 30 years becomes a very urgent site, just as the other side of Somerset House is prone to flooding almost the same time as Mumbai is prone to flooding. So in a way, what began as 3 miles as a unit of space, when it reaches Whale galaxy, it becomes 3 million light years, and thus becomes units of time. But in that, it begins to produce a conversation about birth, death, transience, and sort of imminent urgencies that, in a way, can be contemplated perhaps through that location of the Somerset House, which in a way has a history with the maritime history of the United Kingdom, with the colonial history of the United Kingdom, with terraforming. I mean, that's a whole other conversation which I won't go into. But all that links up to some of the urgencies that we face in the planet today. I think one of the aspects of this work, which kind of, in a way, resonates also with Public Notice 3, is the act of walking. A lot of our wisdom traditions actually have walking as a way of reflecting, ambulation, upward ambulation, or circular ambulation as a way of thinking. And I think this becomes a kind of pathway. This is again 2 years before the piece at Somerset House. There's a consistent drawing practice in the studio, different drawing rituals, all of which I don't share here. But this was a work I made coincidentally on the 1st of Jan 2021. And it actually began with a few months of actually having rather intuitively set up each of the computers that I use in the studio to a homepage that would read algorithmically the number of us that are alive on the planet at that moment. So even if I just take my eyes on it, look away and look back, that number's gone somewhere. And this would somehow change the intuitions for that moment as I would even begin the studio. And it was just a momentary thing almost every day. But perhaps because it was 1st of Jan, there was this impulse to make a drawing. So this drawing called Integer Studies Drawing from Life essentially has 3 numbers. On the top is this is the number of us estimated to be alive at 9:25:14 seconds on 1st of Jan from my location in the studio. This is the number of us that have passed away, forming a negative integer, the number of us born since the midnight of that day. And somehow, having made that first drawing, I knew there was a kind of a flow of intuitions that I haven't had doing anything else in the studio. And so in the course of that day, I made 4 drawings. And the next day I made another one. And then somehow, there are many things you start in the studio that normally don't go anywhere. But progressively, this became perhaps the most important activity that drove everything I did in the studio for 2021. Something like this would be a long number, but would end up with a number like number 4, and it would just count down to the number of members in my family, and somehow materialize this whole idea of humanity as a kind of a thought, as a kind of abstraction, which is a number, but also a thought form that would actually hold the 3 images together. When I made that first drawing, we were 7.8 billion of us. By the last drawing, 365 days later, which became a sort of portfolio of 365 drawings, we had crossed 7.9 billion. We are, I think, at 8.12 billion today, and it's just this exponential numbers of us. This is one of the ways in which they've been shown. This was Ishara Foundation in the UAE. And at other times, these drawings have become almost like an immersive wallpaper, that kind of become like a ledger of sorts. As you move, every 4 days, there's a million more of us. Every few weeks, all of Australia gets added on. Another few weeks, we have one more Canada on the planet. And it just keeps growing exponentially. And there's this. So this piece in this particular instance is seen alongside a body of work called Epicycles. So as I was saying earlier, there are 2 things that happen in the studio. One is the finding of a form, the making of a form as a way to reach out to meanings that are beyond the scope of my access on that day. Sometimes it's a form that tells you something. And at other times, it's actually finding the form. It's moving through archives, through dates, through utterances, such as the case with Public Notice 3, that sometimes becomes a space from where meaning is produced. And it's sometimes the organization of these forms, which are found in an archive, that become the work. At other times, it's actually the making of the form. And I think both continue sort of parallelly in the studio. This is a painting called Postulates from a Restless Radius. And the form of the painting itself comes from the Albers projection of planet Earth, which is a conical cartographic projection of planet Earth. So it's Earth unfolded like a cone that takes this form. And all the latitudinal and longitudinal lines are actually drawn with a watercolor pencil. They actually become a very unstable surface within which I begin to sort of draw and paint. All of these run parallelly. The integer studies, the epicycles, so they're almost in the 2 years. One of the things that happen in these paintings are essentially this movement of form through air and water. Somehow, it takes a river 1,000 years to change course on planet Earth, but on a really good day in the studio, these sort of geological processes, begin to sort of emerge within short periods of time as air and water interact in a certain way. And it's sometimes just the manner in which a form hydrates that produces a certain condition to the reading of an image. And sometimes it allows you to sort of navigate this long arc from the bodily to the celestial to the geological to the suboceanic. These are words one can use, but really, it's really where words can't go is where the images take you. Here again, the form comes from a kind of planetary form. If all sides were dropped, it would form a globe. So this is essentially what is called the Waterman butterfly projection of planet Earth. And it opens up the globe in this form that then becomes a kind of space within which a kind of abstraction can begin to emerge. So one can think of integer studies as almost like a doppelganger to, something that happens in a course of a year, but the intuitions find form in this kind of a work around the same time. This was a body of work called Epicycles that began pretty much within the fortnight of having returned to the studio in the week when the US was shutting down and India was going into a hard lockdown. So actually flying back from an exhibition I opened in Nashville and settled into the studio in isolation to, of course, protect the family. But as a result, had a completely heightened experience of the studio. I mean, things like a crack in the wall, the image right below there is essentially the abstraction of the chair I've been sitting on, the point at which it has touched the ground for 7 years. And in a way, the weight of my body and the movement of the chair has produced an abstraction. And this is something I would never look at, except under the conditions that we were all in. But essentially what I began doing was making a small series of notational drawings in a book. But as I left the United States, I'd bought a book called The Family of Man. This exhibition that some of you may be familiar with, which took place at MoMA, Edward Chaichan's exhibition, that traveled to 63 countries, came to several cities in India, and was like a snapshot of humanity in the post-war world. The exhibition had all its complexities in its time, but somehow, half a century later, at a moment when us as a species were experiencing a certain collective sense of whatever connected us at that moment until we once again break apart, is really was an interesting reflective moment for me. And I came to the Family of Man because of the work that I will share after this. But in the studio, somehow these small images of change in the studio began to intermingle with the images from Family of Man. Oops, sorry. So this piece is almost like a translucent lens, and you'll see that figures emerge as you move in the presence of the work. Elsewhere, figures might completely appear or disappear. And it's really our animation of our movement in the room that actually, in a way, retrieves the kind of animation in these bodies in the Family of Man going through birth, death, war, all kinds of images that continue to mark our life. But in a way, the small crack in the studio wall becomes host to an image from half a century ago. And as one turns to the verso of the work, on the other side are these abstractions, and they come from the integer study drawings. So in fact, what began as a kind of year-long process of making forms that sat alongside integers then became forms that became the verso of these images. What was completely coincidental for me was that somewhere around the third work, I had this feeling that this studio itself was from the 50s. And when I checked, it was really the studio was completed as a building in 1955, which is a complete coincidence. But then it sort of brings home the fact that every chip of plaster that I was documenting was actually laid in the same year that Family of Man began his journey. That was the kind of coincidences that the studio sometimes encounters. So this is a piece called Covering Letter Terranum Nuncius. And the title, of course, is an inversion of Galileo's Sederius Nuncius, which says message from the stars, and this inverts it by saying message from the earth. This is what took me to Family of Man. But in this work, there's a set of horn speakers that create an immersive sound in the room. There are 116 images that sit on a round table. A projected image of a star-like form which was meant to mark our solar system relative to 14 stars, 14 pulsars. These were all the sounds and images that left planet Earth in 1977 on the Voyager 1 and 2 space mission, and were composed by Frank Drake and Carl Sagan as a kind of summary of life on Earth. It's drifting away from us at something like 17 kilometers per second and are likely to go on way after we are gone, way after perhaps the Earth is gone. They all have expiry dates. The sun at some point has an expiry date. So it's likely to go on in the vastness of empty space. And if it comes upon an intelligence life as it was thought, then this would be the only utterance we've left in the universe and outside of the solar system. But to me, what was actually quite... I can play this first.
阿丹的书书
太空朋友，您好，您食饱未？有闲就来阮遮坐。
تحياتنا للأصدقاء في النجوم يا ليت يجمعنا الزمان.
Shalom.
Բոլոր անոնց, որ գտնվին դիեզերքի միքամազություններեն անտին, ողջույններ.
Namaskar. Bishe Shanti.
ไว้ลักเนี่ย
各位好嗎？祝各位平安、健康、快樂。
Milí přátelé, přejeme vám vše nejlepší.
Hartelijke groeten aan iedereen.
Hello from the children of planet Earth.
Bonjour tout le monde.
So this would be the only voices that would circulate in this, But what drew me to this set of images was really the lack and absence of vocabulary that we face in the world today, where Republicans can't speak to Democrats or Hindus and Muslims and all kinds of divisions that somehow seem to have manifest and challenge us today to find vocabulary. What would it do to actually look at a missive or a letter that actually goes so far in space and time that the other is an indeterminate one, both in space and time? And what does it make us reflect of that utterance when we view it from a collective location of departure that becomes our planet Earth? And somehow this intuition is what drew me to this work. Of course, public notice would have led me to these intuitions, many, many years later. But they come out of the same instinct to find meaning in a sort of resident set of forms elsewhere. And in this instance, so the images that were uploaded in 1977 were all not images because they could not be uploaded on a disk. They didn't have the computing power. So they were encrypted as tiny sound files, assuming that an interstellar intelligence will easily decode it on the basis of a few codes. So a California-based programmer named Ron Barry followed the same codes that an alien would have to do to find us in that image. And those returned as these black and white forms. That became the circuitous form that becomes part of the artwork. This return address of ours, these were the images from childbirth to dimensions of celestial bodies. This image was also in the family of man, for instance. So they were referencing from that previous archive of images. We ate, drink, we tasted. This was meant to be the return address. So if the alien species had to find us, this was the code. But since 1977, we know that there are not 14 pulsars, but a few 100,000 pulsars in our neighborhood. So even our own cosmic location is actually quite faulty in the way we've shared it. The only seating in the space takes the form of this bench. And this bench had a kind of parting limb. This has recurred in a few of my works. And it's the bench that takes the form of the doomsday clock. The doomsday clock, for some of you may be familiar, was actually something that the doomsday clock was actually proposed by the very physicists that made the first atom bomb, because they made the bomb and they realized that this could annihilate the planet. So in a spirit of urgency, they put out a bulletin which said it's 7 minutes to midnight. But since that time, it's been reset every year based on a shifting planetary condition. So in the year that I made the work, it was 2 minutes to midnight. This year, it's 90 seconds to midnight, and it progresses along. I'll end with 4 works, which brings us into public notice. So this was Covering Letter, a piece I made a few years, just 2 years after we had Public Notice 3 here, called Covering Letter. Covering Letter has a letter that emerges in a sort of film of mist. And just play this. And as one comes into the dark room, one walks onto this shaft of light that has words flowing towards you. As one looks up, one sees the date is 5 weeks before the onset of the Second World War. One can kind of survey the letter, but one can also kind of move through the letter. It's only when the letter begins to leave that you see that the author of the letter was Mahatma Gandhi and the intended recipient was Adolf Hitler. And it's a 7-line plea asking Hitler to kind of rethink his ways in the world. The only word that recurs in the entire letter is the word friend. It begins with dear friend and it ends with your sincere friend, forming a kind of parenthesis of friendship, something that a lot of people would find complicated. But Mahatma Gandhi himself sort of qualifies it a year later by saying that in my world of universal friendship, I know no foe. So he writes a second letter where he actually qualifies his first letter. So up until now, we've kind of traveled backwards, but now I'll sort of jump back to 2003, which was the first public notice, forming the trilogy that then becomes Public Notice 3. So this was a speech delivered at the midnight of Indian independence by India's first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru. In a way, thinking through what the formation of a nation might mean. This came out of a complex moment of a riot in the western state of Gujarat, where in fact I began rereading this text, but I also began in fact reflecting on one image that follows any form of protest or anger. Death of a politician, something gets set aflame. It's almost like a projection of human anger or folly corresponds with this image of something being set on fire. And somehow for me, this recurrent image of flame became this form to actually write the words itself. And as these words are written with an inflammable fluid, it begins to kind of distort the mirrored surface it's written on. And progressively, as one gets closer to the work, it sort of produces multiple reflections of the self even around a single alphabet. So the first public notice took the form of a kind of cremated letter. The second public notice was 4 years later. So the trilogy happened in the course of a decade. The second public notice was a speech delivered by Mahatma Gandhi before he began this legendary historic march called the Salt March, which up until that point, every Indian was denied the right to make salt. And in a way, having announced that he's going to end the march with the breaking and making of salt, he thought this could either lead to his assassination or arrest, and either ways that would lead to some kind of violence. So this is a speech calling for complete civil disobedience with complete peace. Total non-cooperation with total non-violence. Completely the opposite to the kind of oxymoronic calls we now hear in the public domain. War on terror, war is terror. So in a way, it's kind of, a speech that also in a way reincarnates in many, many nations, whether it's Mandela or whether it's Martin Luther King in this country. This speech reincarnates in other forms, in other utterances. And the speech itself takes the form of these multiple fossils, bones that become the letter. And 3 years later, it kind of completed the trilogy with the speech that Swami Vivekananda delivered at this very site in 1893. So as one comes in from, let's say, the Michigan Avenue, his words in a way speak to us in first person, beginning with an address that's now been a kind of world-changing set of words, but then with words such as end of fanaticism, fundamentalism, bigotry, spoken on the very date, 108 years before the attacks, but also in a way calling for a certain kind of urgent reflection on where the world might be, but through a kind of refraction through these 5 colors that the US Homeland Security had marked as threat codes. So many of you may recall, for every day, the Bush administration had a color, and it always remained red or orange or yellow for most of the time, for almost the whole decade. That becomes a kind of prism through which a different kind of a call for urgency sort of intersects, So this is actually the location where he spoke, which more or less falls at the very center of the grand staircase. The audiences sat here facing in that direction. I mean, to me, architecturally, the grand staircase produced the condition of doubling and quadrupling. So if you come in from either side, you have the speech doubled. They double in the center, but they quadruple on the 4 sides. So any path you take, you read the same set of words. And produces these kind of various overlaid, readings, being a kind of encyclopedic museum, these incredible sightlines. I mean, in a lot of wisdom traditions, 108 becomes a full cycle. It's the number of beads you chant with. It's also astronomically 108 times the diameter of the earth gets you to the sun, and 108 times the diameter of the moon gets you to the earth. And somehow it's a kind of number that even sustains life forces in some ways. And these coincidences, as they are, began to produce a kind of matrix that kept becoming more and more compelling to become Public Notice 3. But I think we can talk a lot more, and I think it'd be great to have Madhu join me, in conversation. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jitish. That was truly amazing to hear about some of your recent work, but also to recollect the Public Notice series. I think maybe I'll pick up the threads from here. And I was just thinking, you're coming back 14 years after having installed and seen Public Notice at the time of the 10th anniversary of 9/11, and my reaching out to you to invite you to come and install Public Notice again. I know that I never expected that we would have this opportunity to work again, especially with Public Notice. How does it feel to be back here 14 years later, and having now been through installing Public Notice 3, how does it feel? In some ways, doesn't it like as though time has stopped, but in other ways, 14 years have passed?
Yeah, I think, unlike any other work I've done, Public Notice, while there have been other institutions that have invited me to sort of realize it, and I've been offered multiple museum staircases. As you see in my work, there's not a single language, it's not a single medium, it's not a single material. I'm not trying to return to a kind of recurrent language or find a singular vocabulary. So to kind of return, no other staircase made sense, And so, in a way, it's so integrally tied to this space that if the work ever has to speak, it has to be from this site. So it had to be an institutional invitation, for the work to ever speak again, And so to me, it was actually a very interesting and beautiful phone call from you.
I remember years ago, when we were first conceiving Public Notice 3, that we were talking about many different staircases. It wasn't that it was like we just plumbed for the grand staircase. And now when I think about it, I don't think it would have had the same kind of meaning if it was any other staircase at the Art Institute. It had to be like this one, right?
It had to be. It wasn't a very complex decision, except that, realizing it in 2010 was complex because there were 70,000 bulbs and 70,000 lenses that were hand inscribed into the stairs.
And painted, hand-painted as well.
Yeah, hand-colored lenses. So it was a complicated work to realize. It also meant putting some kind of a halt into the normal institutional ebb and flow. So it needed a lot of sign-ins from multiple departments and all that. So it just had to be only the complexity of how would it be realized. But the site itself, being the exact sort of location where Swami Vivekananda spoke, that was, it had just had to be the grand staircase, but except for the complexities that location held for the realization of the work.
Do you want to share a little bit with this audience about how Public Notice 3 came up as a concept and its kind of older iterations, because people now may not remember that. And I'm sure there are a lot of people who are new here.
So actually my first engagement with that particular speech goes back now 25 years. So its first iteration, in fact, I think Julie Walsh should be in this room. So I want to give a shout out to her. Julie Walsh ran this very interesting gallery called Walsh Gallery 20 years ago. And so in 2003, or 2004, was the first time I actually made a piece that actually had the speech. And I love synchronicities that go beyond the scope of anything that one can do. As it happened, due to series of contingencies and chance, the exhibition actually opened on 9/11. The speech was to do with 9/11. It was opened when every other gallery in Chicago had opened their exhibitions. So it was the same date, a collective date by all the galleries. And I remember walking into the Art Institute and encountering the Vivekananda way, walking through the grand staircase. But of course, one wasn't thinking of the work as a work. It was just the experience of actually moving through the space, energetically thinking about reflections on the words, etc. And then I realized an iteration of this at the Guangzhou Triennale in 2009, which almost became, I would think, as a kind of, like a little laboratory in a distant place that created the ground for this work to actually happen. It was really...
Well, explain to them that it was on a staircase.
It was on a staircase. It was done with completely remotely. I couldn't access the staircase myself. Did all the drawings in the studio. It was realized remotely. But somehow, the image got around. It had reached Madhu's attention. Through Madhu, Jim Kuno's attention. And, so again, I recall Jim Kuno very sort of, being a very central figure in, making this work happen.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, it was. It feels as though what you'd done in Gwangju was the first test of the work, and then realizing it here in a much grander scale, and then also the way in which the work splits up, and the iteration with the color, kind of you expanded much more from that work. But it was very interesting, I think, for me, when I was studying those previous iterations, to see how your thoughts evolved until this moment.
Yeah, because the grand staircase has this kind of doubling and quadrupling, which architecturally in some ways can be thought of as an equivalent of the echo, So in a way, the speech doubles on the two sides. Depending on whichever side you come from, you read the same set of words. You turn left or right, you read the same set of words. As you ascend further, any of the four directions, you read the same set of words. So eventually, any person moving through will read the exact set of words, except for a lingering feeling that one has probably not read everything. Most people tend to go back the other side and begin to read, which to me became almost like reproducing the echo of the speech in the sort of inner voice of the reader, so to speak. So it somehow architecturally allowed for that sort of resonance of that space to produce an echo in the reading in some ways.
And one of the things that seems to again be recurring in your work is text. Not just speeches, but just text, because not just the works that you've shared with us, but if one looks at your entire body of work, you've always been interested in words, even in the way that you write. And by the way, I would recommend to all of you that if you'd like to learn more about public notice 3, I would suggest you read the blog that Jitish has written on public notice 3 on our website. It's actually called The Synchronicities of History, and it's beautiful. But you do have this facility with words, and words obviously have a lot of meaning for you, because it seems to be something that you keep, it plays a role in a lot of your work. Do you want to share a little bit about how you think about words, text, and their multiple readings, meanings?
In most of the work, I in a way rely on, like I said, two things happen in the studio. One is the making of a form, and somehow in the form you find the meaning that you otherwise can't find yourself. The other times is it's a kind of a research process through archives, through datum somewhere in the world that holds some kind of a pointer. And sometimes it's really the organization of that, whether it's a text or whether it's sometimes a measurement, that sometimes produces a pointer to create meaning.
It triggers, yeah.
Yeah, and I think most of the texts have actually been existing texts. It's about finding the text. It's about finding the object, More often than not, that's the case in some ways, yeah.
And then the other theme that you did bring up a bit in the works that you've just shared with us is this, your ability to go from the detail, the minutiae, to the very expansive, almost, when you're going into space, dates and specifics to this expanding, and you said it beautifully, in fact, in that blog, but I'd love you to actually talk a bit more about the way you think about this going in very closely, but at the same time also being able to take a broader vision. And so much of your work seems to, go between these two. It's almost like if you do one, you almost have to step back and do something very massive and cosmic almost. So do you want to share a little bit about that process and how it happens? And it was really very interesting hearing you describe integer, but this is something that you've also played with in a lot of other works too, right?
I mean, as artists or creative practitioners, the only fundamental tools we have is that of space and time. Every other thing has to work with it. And sometimes it's really this substrate that we call space and time, the manner in which one organizes it produces what one can create as sort of an optic of meaning. And so I think broadly across my work, I think one thing that happens is this shift in distance. What we do, as I was just saying some time ago, to just look at an object, close or far, perhaps involuntarily, just gets exaggerated. And what does it do to sort of look at that same image from a location that's pointed to backwards, from a kind of space that's outside the solar system, or from a moment which is the first parliament of religions? How does that moment sort of reconfigure our reading of this present moment? So I think that whether it's across an axis of space or an axis of time, that's a kind of recurring thing that I see. It's not something that was actually even clear to me, frankly. I mean, I had a sort of mid-career survey of mine in 2017, and you see 25 years of work that went into it, and somehow when you move through those corridors, you ask questions, what am I doing here? And then in all of that, you realize that the one thing fundamentally that goes on is this shift in scales. So I think it's really about taking it at a certain distance where the meanings change. How does the view of a traffic light change if you just look at the stars briefly and look back at the traffic lights? And does that change anything? If it does, then that's that space in which one can produce something.
Well, I'm conscious of the time, so I do want to say that I'm so grateful that you came back to work with us on putting Public Notice 3 on display again. I'm curious to see how people react to it this time round, whether the reactions are different or the same. Because, again, those words that were spoken back in 1893 seem so prescient and at the same time relevant right now. So at this point, I'd like to open up to any questions you all might have. Just wait for the microphone to come to you. So if you have questions, please do raise your hands. And mics are going to come to you. And then if you don't mind speaking in the mic, because we are taping this.
Is this on? Yeah, okay. Thank you for your talk and also this conversation. I really love the threads of afterlife in your work. You've immortalized the speech in this installation. And have you thought about the future of public notice? How do you imagine it survives after the LEDs fail, when LEDs become completely obsolete, and how technology might influence it a century from now? Will you let the forces of technological obsolescence and age affect the artwork the way that you had mentioned earlier before, that the presence of humidity would affect your watercolor pencil drawings? Yeah, how do you imagine the future of this?
So just materially speaking, as an object, we've defined certain details, which also allows the work not just obsolescence, but perhaps improvements. Because for now, we're able to do it for a third of the energy consumption that it did, or maybe even less than that of what it did in 2010. It's way more stable now than it was in 2010. So I think in a way with a certain template of how the lenses are organized, the words are organized, it was a lot easier to do now than it was in 2010. So I would foresee that it would only get easier if it had to be done again. But we might be able to preserve this as well, so it won't need to be redone, Thank you. Thank you.
So, both the initial speech and the earlier installation of Public Notice 3, what were sort of the public receptions around those? How were they welcomed into the community?
I think each of them, had a different trajectory in some ways. But I think nothing that I've done has actually generated a certain kind of a public feedback loop, which in fact I think surprised many of us even during the time of its previous iteration. I mean, I remember Erin Hogan, which Madhu might speak a bit more about it, would share the kind of letters that she was receiving at the Institute. I recall, a Chicago Tribune writer who extended her byline. Typically they have a closing byline which says, so-and-so can be reached at Chicago Tribune. She extended it to say that who thinks Public Notice 3 needs to be made permanent, So this was the kind of response I've not necessarily had. But each of these works, I think, many a times coincidentally have intersected with moments outside of themselves, sometimes a decade later, as it does, I think, somehow in this present moment, unbeknownst to any of us or unplanned, somehow it just seems to have found its moment to come back and speak again. Was, for instance, let's say with Covering Letter, it was meant to be shown at the Philadelphia Museum. Museum cycles take its own routine, a date gets fixed. The previous elections were announced. It opened the day after Trump came to power and created a complete different kind of a tone to the reading of the work. It's completely unplanned within that letter, but the letter began to speak something else. So one has experienced that with each of these works, that it's the circumstance outside of the work that creates a cast of meaning.
Hi. First of all, I was really inspired by your works, the spectrum. It was really inspiring. To be honest, I think I will be a terrible viewer of your works because I usually don't like reading texts in the art museum, sorry, but to be honest. So I wanted to ask you about the use of text again. As an art student, it's really hard to incorporate texts into artworks because sometimes the text just remains as text and not be seen as images. So I wanted to ask about how do you balance the between text and images? Is it like the way that you did with the light bulbs, like the crafty thing you did with coloring all the 70,000 light bulbs or something? So how do you balance the power of words and images? Yeah.
I was doing an artist talk at MCA in Sydney when Public Notice 2 was being shown at the Art Gallery of New South Wales. And there was an audience member who said that it took her X number of minutes to complete Public Notice 2, which, it's interesting that it's almost like a video work, it produces its own temporality. So yeah, it does ask for a commitment of time. But I think in each of these three Public Notice, I think, and this is again a realization that happened to me after I made even the third work in the trilogy, that I think it somehow aligns with certain existing codes of text-based work, such as, say, concrete poetry, And it wasn't something I'm thinking about concrete poetry, but a decade after, you arrive at your third Public Notice and you look back at it and you realize that in each instance is actually the shifting of the letter into a form. And the form itself, whether it's a cremated letter, a fossilized letter, or a letter as signal, an illuminated signal, all three create a different cast of meaning, but also a different retinal cast. What does it mean to read the words through an overlay of colors that will keep producing their own inversions as you read? What does it mean to look at a layering of fossilized forms in your retina when you're reading something that goes on, for several meters, So I think that's somewhere in the work, this shift between the letter and image.
And if I may add, it doesn't really matter whether, I mean, for some people, reading the speech is part of what they want to do, or they are familiar with the speech, and so they want to experience reading it again. But in a sense, the work is also about interacting with it. And in the interacting with those lights and those colors, you're activating the work. So in a sense, and you'll see this now when you go out and it's darker, how the lights reflect and on the steps. And it's a completely different work during the daytime than it is, in the evening. And in the different seasons, you will experience the work differently. So I think for some people, it is about the text. But I think for the others, it's a very experiential work. So I hope you'll experience it over the seasons and come to enjoy it. All right, do we have any other questions? Yes, I see Junair. Without whom we could not have put it up this time.
Thank you. Lovely speech and lovely, beautiful work. It's good to see your studio practice. I was wondering, given the text you work with and the meaning of word, and you hit on in your earlier work, especially with coding and the messages in outer space and how would an alien species perceive it. What are your thoughts, or how do you, in terms of translation, what if the speech was actually in Hindi instead of English? And how would we perceive it, or its presence, if you have any thoughts on that?
With each of these works, I have changed nothing, In fact, from the transcription of Mahatma Gandhi's speech in Public Notice 2, any typographical errors have retained in the work. So it's the inheritance of the word as it is. What if the speech was in Hindi would be a whole other context. Probably I would do nothing to it. I don't think I would have the moral, ethical, space to actually change anything, except to sort of place it within a location where the body can actually move through it. And I'm very interested in these, what was it, Aristotle and, the peripatetic philosophical traditions, where you're actually, walking and ambulation as a way of reflecting. So whether it's circumambulation, or it's upward ambulation, they all produce conditions of reflection. And to sort of produce a space where the speech itself becomes a container within which every viewer is part of the work, is in the speech. And has this upward ambulation within the speech. I think that's what I do, not the word. So if it was in a certain language, it would probably stay there,
It's like a walking meditation, actually.
Yeah, I'm very interested in those traditions in some ways. And I think that, with the piece in Somerset House, it's a very playful image. When you come inside, it's a highway signage, but it slowly begins because you're walking so much, and then you start moving between 3 miles to 30 million light years, encountering submerged sites and extinct stars, begins to produce another kind of dialogue from a otherwise mundane scripture from a highway.
So we have time for one more question.
Okay.
I just wanted to say that your presentation has been fascinating, including the fact that you brought in previous installations and how it all relates. So my question now is looking towards the future, and I don't know how much you're at liberty to divulge, but what are you thinking about for your next exhibition, and where are you thinking it will be in the world? So thank you.
There are actually so many open loops, in the studio. Yeah, it's so hard to tell which dormant loop awakens, Like a piece I made quite recently was actually after 12 years of reflecting on these objects. It's a piece called Antimbra. I just realized now after 12, 13 years of sitting as an image, and then led me to a very difficult sort of journey through prisons and archives to actually really come upon, this 600 desk calendars that had kept time with Nelson Mandela in his prison. That became a work after 12 years of being an open loop. And suddenly everything starts coming together. In terms of an exhibition, Epicycles, which have this intersection of images from the studio with Family of Man, is most likely to be shown at Mudam in the coming year and a half or so in Luxembourg, which also then takes it back to the very location where Family of Man, after traveling 60 countries, has now been permanently installed in Luxembourg. And so they kind of, again, they reunite. So these are, they're just cycles and loops that take their own time to become works. So I don't know, when I go back to the studio, what's the next step really?
Well, I think at this point we should all put our hands together and thank Jitish for this amazing experience.